There's a thin line between running away from something and running towards it. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you for spending some time with me. Today, I have a review for you of Coffin Moon. This is the new novel by Keith Rosson. It comes out September 9th, being published by Random House, and I was offered a complimentary copy in exchange for an honest review. And, if you have read Keith Rosson's previous novels, Fever House, and then its sequel, Devil by Name, which I have a review for. I'll put a link down in the description. Those were over the top. They threw everything in, angels, demons, psyops, kind of zombies, everything. And it was very frenetically paced. The moving, it didn't stop, right? Everything felt turned up to 11 the whole time. This story is not like that. It's much more subdued, even though there are some intense action scenes, but it has a whole different vibe. So the story is set in 1975, and the main character, Dwayne, is a Vietnam vet. He's coming back. He clearly has PTSD. He is working as a bartender, yet he's trying to stay sober. But the reason he's working as a bartender is because his wife's family owns the bar. He and his wife live on top of the bar. And they've recently adopted his niece, his wife's sister's daughter, because his wife's sister has gone away for life. And you don't know why at the beginning, but you find out eventually. So clearly this daughter, who is like a tween, like 12, 13, I think, maybe 14, she clearly has her own issues as well. She has her own PTSD that she's going through. When you find out why her mother was locked away, you kind of see where she's coming from. So you have this kind of troubled family that is trying to make their way. They're things are looking up. Like, he's been sober a while. He's got his stuff together. He still has night terrors, but like, he's getting over it, And then something happens. And the jacket copy for this book gives away quite a lot, especially considering the pacing of the book. So it's kind of inevitable that you're going to figure out what the precipitating event is, but I'm not going to be spoilery here. But there is a little bit spoiled in the jacket copy, just because the first part of the book that builds up to the main precipitating event takes a while. But I'll get to that in a second. In any case, Dwayne and his niece, Julia, I believe, have to go on the run because they've crossed paths with a vampire that is not too happy with them, let's say. And so they've crossed paths with this vampire, and they're on the run from the vampire. But at the same time, they decide they need to take the fight to the vampire. So there's this constant push and pull between hunting out this vampire, but also being afraid of him, and trying to figure out whether they are the hunted or the hunters. And that's how the story plays out. Now, I really liked this story. I thought the pacing, like I said, was much more subdued when compared to Fever House. So if you've read Keith Rosson's previous novels and really expect this to be balls to the wall, then you'll be disappointed. But if you go in there expecting this introspective character study that involves vampires, then I think you're going to have a lot of fun. This story, it doesn't shy away from being emotional, and it finds the perfect vehicle for that in the vulnerability of its characters. All of the characters feel fully fleshed out. They feel really interesting. They feel multi-layered. They feel genuine. And that includes the antagonist, right? The antagonist, the vampire, you get a little bit of his backstory. There are a few chapters where you jump back in time a couple hundred years, or maybe a little more than 100 years, and you find out like how he became a vampire, what led to it, all these things. And so you learn his story as well as our main protagonist story. And the vampire himself picks up a friend along the way. You find out the vampire is queer, and so he picks up a boyfriend who is somewhat psychopathic or homicidal. And so this gay vampire and his homicidal boyfriend are on the run from, but also hunting, Dwayne and his adopted niece, who are similarly on the run from these vampires, but also hunting them. So I love this dynamic, this push and pull. And all of these characters, they're given full stories, right? For the most part, and even the ancillary characters. That's because the story takes its time. So when they actually go on the run, it doesn't happen right away. You get a decent amount of buildup. You get a decent amount of time to settle into what it's like living in 1975 Oregon as a Vietnam vet, what his home life is like, what his work life is like, all the things that are going on in his mind, to set up these dynamics, how his marriage has gone up and down, up and down. You're really able to spend time in this world, and I think that's delightful. But that means when he and Julia have to go on the run, it makes it all that much more devastating, right? Because you spent all this time building up a picture of this life. So I think the characters are really interesting. I think the take on vampire mythology is really fun. It's more or less your standard vampire mythos, but he's tweaked it a little bit here and there to make it his own, and I think it works really well for the story. If you look at the overall plot of the story, it isn't spectacularly new, more or less kind of a revenge kind of story, right? But at the same time, he is able to use this more or less common trope or this common narrative through line And he uses that to really good effect because he adds enough backstory and enough twists that will keep you engaged, right? It keeps the story lively, and he exploits the retro feel of being set in 1975. And he exploits the world building, and he exploits this narrative conceit to really tell a timeless story. That's a story that is about love and about responsibility. You really have this duo of this, broken Vietnam vet and his adopted niece, who is also in her own way broken, who are trying to find themselves, who are trying to figure out how they exist in the world, what their idea of right and wrong is, right? What is morality in a world where everything seems to be against you, where no one is taking you seriously, where all the things that you loved are taken away from you in ways that you have no control over. So the two of them are finding themselves and finding each other as they are hunting this vampire and also being hunted by this vampire. So using this tried and true plot structure works well because then it gives him a chance to do more interior work, which I think he does really well. The writing itself is crisp, it is descriptive, it keeps things moving, it always has a sense of momentum. Now I said, unlike Fever House, it doesn't feel frenetic, it doesn't feel like everything's going around in circles all the time, and it doesn't have that sense of chaos that Fever House has, but it definitely has a sense of momentum, right? So it's not a slow story in any way. It just gives you time to feel the story as it builds and builds and builds. So it's always increasing the tension, but it never feels like it's slowed down. So the writing itself is propulsive and moves, it's descriptive. I think what's really nice about it is that these characters, like I said, they feel complete, but they're also full of jagged edges. You never really know if you're going to cut yourself when you look at them too closely. And that goes for the antagonists as well as the protagonists. As a result of that, none of the characters feel convenient. They don't feel phoned in. And so the story itself, it allows for an emotional investment, right? That I think is really useful for this story. That's what the story is about, is this emotional investment. Now, that is mixed in with a handful of action scenes that I think are done really well, and they're well spaced throughout the story. So you get these action scenes as these bright like pops of blood and violence and excitement. And that keeps you moving, it keeps you rolling, and it gives you a chance to step back from the emotional beats to just kind of wallow in this gore for a little bit. So I think those are also really well done. I think Rosson, he doesn't shy away from using spectacle in order to move the story forward, right? That is the beauty of it. Every time there is this action beat and this spectacle that he offers you, it isn't over the top, but they do fit very, firmly in the horror genre. He uses it to move the characters forward, to move the story forward. He doesn't use it just to show off that he can write this bloody, gruesome scene. And so I think his use of action is really effective. It works with the story. Now, I do think there is some missed potential in this story, right? I don't think it's a perfect story. What is really missing from it for me to make it really great is you have these two on the run, and I really wanted more of a road trip story. Now, the story is quite short. It's a lot shorter than I had expected it to be quite honest. And the length fits the story he's telling, so it doesn't feel too short. He does have a whole story here, but it could have been longer. He could have added an extra 50 pages and you wouldn't have felt bored, right? He has enough in this world going on that he could have stretched it out a little bit, maybe added in one or two more action scenes and given you more meat on the bone, and it would have been enjoyable. Because what I really would have liked to see is this kind of dark road trip story. I think he could have added more speed bumps to the journey these two were going on to really give a sense of weariness with them, because the story does have this sense of weariness, right? This sense of desperation. And I think if you had given them more time on the road, with them on the road, right? We see them on the road, but we only see them when they get to a new destination. And then we get to them planning and them figuring what they're going to do next. But we don't really get the sense of travel, of just like the weariness of constantly being on the run. Right. And I would have liked that. We get a little bit from the vampire side because they're also on the run. They're also constantly moving. But I think he really missed an opportunity here to draw the story out a little bit more and to give us more time with the interior life of these characters. But with that said, not everyone likes stories to be pulled out a little longer. So maybe going for the shorter, tighter story is more effective. Maybe that is more attractive to you. I don't know. I know for me, it feels like a missed potential. I like road trip stories. I like what you can do with a road trip story. And I think that everything else in this story lends itself to using that as a way for even greater character interiority, because the story really is about the characters. These characters, and again, antagonists included, they're complicated combinations of tragedy and circumstance and just bad decisions, right? Trying to do the best you can when your options are very limited. And I think that is really compelling. There are a lot of ideas that he's exploring in this story, and I think he does it really well. Like I said earlier, I think, at the heart of the story is this idea of love and responsibility and what you would do for the people that you love, and what does that say about you as a person, right? What lengths you're willing to go to. But at the same time, when it's talking about that in the context of family and about the context of redemption, right? How far can you go that you're still able to come back and not lose yourself? Where is that line where you no longer are you anymore, where you've lost something vital? And all of that is wrapped up in these ideas of trauma, PTSD, substance abuse, dedication, loyalty, self-awareness, and knowing what it means or what it feels like to perpetually be the outsider. Because all of our characters are outsiders. The vampire, his boyfriend, our main character, and his niece, they're all outsiders. And you see how that experience of being outside of what is accepted as normal, as good, as happy, as healthy, as acceptable, being on the outside, how that affects them differently, and how they take it to different places, and how some of them internalize it and some of them externalize it, how some of them take their rage and they turn it into shame and self-loathing, and some of them take their rage and they turn it into frenzied homicidal mania, right? Or somewhere in between. So I think all these things are really interestingly explored. And while I personally would have liked it to be a little longer, or not necessarily even that I wanted it longer, but I would have liked to spend more time on this road trip portion of the story, even if that meant cutting down a little bit in the beginning where you're doing this build up and this like tension building and setting the scene. While I personally would have liked that, I think what he did do is quite effective. You get an interesting vampire story that isn't quite like ones I've seen before, but it has enough of things that you're expecting that you feel comfortable with the story right away. The world is built up and it feels fully dimensional, right? It doesn't feel flat. And you're given the story that really is about a man and this girl who he's essentially adopting as a daughter, and this relationship between adult and child, and what it means to be responsible for someone other than yourself. And maybe by trying to save someone else, are you able to save yourself in the process? That's part of the question that is being asked. And I think he does a really good job of exploring it. So I really enjoyed the story. I think you will too, especially if you like vampire stories, if you like stories of essentially father-daughter bonding and what it means to take care of someone and to take care of yourself and find redemption for yourself by caring for others, because that's what our characters are trying to do. And what happens when the whole world is against you and your quest to do that. You know, the story itself, like I said, it borrows a lot from the tradition and from the genre. So you feel comfortable right away falling into the story because you already recognize many different pieces of it. And then he takes those things you recognize and he builds on top of them in such a way that this never feels boring and never feels like something you've already read. It feels like something you're comfortable with, but going into new territory. And so because of that, I definitely think it's worth a read. I'd love to know, have any of you read this yet? Have you read any of his other books, such as Fever House or Devil by Name? What do you think of those? What do you think of a more subdued, a more interior vampire story instead of the widely frenetic, occult story that was Fever House? I'd love to hear your thoughts, your opinions, everything else down below in the comments. But for now, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.